McCallum King.
Thank you. And today we've invited you to talk about our water. And we have some questions which we provided ahead of time. And I was wondering, what does water mean to you?
Well, we need clean water to survive. Not only do we need it, but the birds and the animals and the fish need it also.
Thank you. And then do you know it as a different word or term?
I don't know that.
Okay.
And I've been around the elders a lot, and I haven't heard any other explanation in EAC or SUPIEC.
Sure. And then what would you like the younger generations to know about our water?
Well, I think it's important that the younger generations of people growing up now, that they learn to take care of our water and how important it is. We've had some situations in the past where, growing up, where water was threatened at times and was unsafe to drink. Before the earthquake, I can remember where warnings would go out to the community about boiling your water before you drink it, and they would actually put a public announcement out to do that. Back then, we were operating on lake water from Eac Lake and water from local shallow reservoirs. In the area that I lived, the reservoir was right on where the ski area is located now, and also there was back in those days there was no sewer system, so everybody used septic tanks. The septic tanks, there was nobody there around at that time to pump them the way they are now, so they were abandoned or bailed out.
And do you know any important places for water?
You mean, I don't...
Like you already mentioned one, Eac Lake. So since we're using Eac Lake as drinking water, it was an important place, and so we wanted to make sure it was clean, correct?
Right. And with the amount of activity that there is around Eac Lake, it's been a source of problems with septic systems going into the west end of the lake and stuff like that. When we used to swim in the lake when we were kids, we were told that to only swim on the east side of the spit and not on the west side, because the west side was polluted.
And do you know of any critical animals, birds or fish for the water? Or?
Well, if we're talking about salt water, it seems to me that it's important to keep our salt water clean and pristine.
That's a really good point. And also you made another good point, which is the salt water versus or fresh water, the difference between the two.
Right. Well, our salt water was threatened by the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and we're still recovering from that. Our herring spawn in the intertidal in brackish areas where freshwater streams run into salt water in the kelp in those areas. And so in a lot of those places close to Titlic, the herring haven't come back. So they were affected by the oil and by the treating of the beaches with hot steam and certain type of algaes that they put in to treat the oil to make it disappear. And so we're still suffering from that, whereas people don't trust digging the clams. They don't trust some of the fish and stuff like that that were in those contaminated areas.
Those are really good points. And then are there any other concerns, such as sayings or stories about taking care of our water, that you know or that you would like to share?
Well, I grew up at a time when you know, a lot of people used remote areas to live in, you know, where they're trapping camps or fish camps and stuff like that. And it was always important that these sites were located in an area where there's protection from the wind, a good water source, and good firewood. And so it's real important to have fresh water wherever you're going to have people staying or using the area. And so it's always been a policy of mine when I go to these areas, hunting and fishing and stuff like that, I either get water from springs or running water to drink, and not stagnant water, you know, from beaver ponds or regular lily pad ponds. I just know that could be a problem with diseases and stuff like that in the water.
And then in your lifetime, have you noticed changes in the water or of any of the waters?
Oh yeah, I've noticed lots of changes.
What kind of changes?
Well, for one, you know, the fish waste coming from the processors that goes into the bay is ground up and real fine, and it's actually suspended in the water column, and where that waste hits the bottom, it uses all the oxygen, so there's dead zones in front of places where they're dumping the salmon waste out from the processors. But those problems have been addressed, and they're trying to clean those areas up. That's one of the things that I've noticed. I've noticed glacier streams where small glaciers are disappearing. Snowpack seems to be less in the mountains in the last 10 years. So a lot of the streams dry up in the middle of summer, and those streams are real critical for salmon fry growing up and also for salmon spawning. So the climate change that's going on is detrimental in some senses in our area.
And then before we had running water, how did you live before the running water?
Well, I never experienced that. It was before my time. But,
Okay.
but I have been in remote areas myself and lived in remote areas where there wasn't running water. And we always packed our water, and it was in water buckets. And we always make a point to boil, you know, our water if it was questionable. So it's, you know, I have experienced places without water, and water's really important for bathing and drinking.
Yes, and the next question was, how did you make sure you had clean water? And you kind of answered it with the boiling water.
Right.
Thank you. And then, how does water provide for you and your community besides drinking water?
Well, we use water for transportation, and one of the most important things in the community of Cordova is that we use water for hydroelectric power, so we're getting away from burning diesel fuel. And so we're on 80% hydropower, which saves money for everybody, the fish processors and the local residents. So that's the two most important things. Well, I forgot the question again.
Oh, how does water provide for you and your community?
Hydropower from water, and it's a real necessity in the processing plants for just helping with processing the fish and cleaning the fish.
And then we answered this next question, we kind of answered it, but if you have any additional comments, would love to hear it. How does the area where fresh water meets salt water, also described as quote unquote the place where life begins, provide for you?
Well, that's changed. The place where the fresh water meets the salt water has changed. We had a earthquake in 1974 where the land came up between 25 and 7 feet. Some areas subsided, so that area has changed. And it was real critical in our area, in Orca Inlet here, because the clams and crabs in that habitat, it was detrimental to them because the clams got pushed out and of the sand, and they started leaving. And that was one of our main sources of food for our ancestors that lived in this area, the shallow water people. I've been on digs at Plugvik where the midden piles were 50 to 60 feet deep of decomposed clam shells. And so the ancient people in this area, subsisted on clams mostly. And today, with the uplift and the sea otters that have moved into our area, it's hard to even find a clam now. So it's been a huge change in that intertidal area where clams live and crabs. But I think it's important too for salmon and salmon habitat because that's where they grow up. They use those areas for food.
And that was the 1964 earthquake.
Right.
And what foods do you collect? Like plants, fish, shellfish, anything in the area?
Well, we harvest hooligan in the spring in the freshwater streams. As they come out of the salt water, they migrate up the rivers to spawn. So we harvest hooligan. We hunt ducks in that same area and geese. We have a spring subsistence hunt. And we have migratory birds that nest. We got seagulls that nest and use that intertidal area to raise their young, and we harvest seagull eggs. So I'm losing track of what the question was.
Okay, no problem. I'll repeat it. What foods do you collect? Plants, fish, shellfish, or anything from our area?
Oh, from the whole area?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, we on the delta, which is is a tidal area, we harvest moose, ducks, geese. We trap beavers, land otters, mink, marten, stuff like that in those areas. And I think that our main subsistence food from the water would be salmon, although we do harvest halibut and rockfish and other things, from that nearshore area.
And then also, do you feel that our water can be dangerous to the safety of our community, and if so, how?
Yeah, I did quite a bit of thinking on this. I think that we have evidence that the earthquake that we had in Japan, that with the amount of debris that came into our shores, they've looked for nuclear waste and stuff like that, and it hasn't been recorded. But the oceans are a highway for garbage and debris coming from the other companies. Countries. We got the Japanese current that comes onto our shores and bringing plastic and debris. And so there's a potential there that we could get some contaminants that aren't even from our area. And, I'm not even sure what the effects of our own sewer treatment plant have on the Orca Inlet and the bay out here. It's always bothered me that they claim it's all treated and stuff like that, but it's being put out in the bay, and then the harbor is another source of contamination. When we were kids, it seemed like the harbor flushed better, and we did catch herring and smelt and stuff like that right in front of town that nobody even thought about it could be contaminated, because back then we didn't think like that, and there was no evidence that it would be contaminated. But now we have to worry about things like that, with all the runoff and antifreeze and stuff like that from boats and batteries being thrown in the harbor. It's not a safe place to harvest some of those subsistence foods.
Yes. So now there's no herring or smelt in the harbor now?
There's a lot less than there used to be, and but with the attitude of the people of that they kind of turn their nose up when you offer somebody some spelt. They say, well, where'd they come from? Oh, we got a net in the harbor. Oh, I don't know if I want to eat those or not. So I don't think there's as many people interested in harvesting like we used to right out of our own harbor.
And then one of the last questions is, in the past, were there any areas in your community that you knew of or noticed that needed to be protected because of the water, and why it needed protected?
Well, it's kind of not a very good subject, but with the logging practices that went on, we've seen evidence in Prince William Sound where once the trees were taken off the hillside, that the ground didn't have anything to hold it, and we had big rains, and so we had floods and landslides. And when this occurs, it chokes salmon streams and changes the habitat. So that's one of the things where our water could be threatened if we had clear-cut logging. I've seen evidence in Canada where it actually killed the complete runs of salmon in certain streams. And I'm sure that it's happened in Alaska and southeast Alaska. But I'm not too familiar with those areas, but I have talked to other tribal members that live in those areas that said that is the case, and they're ashamed that their corporations were involved in that.
Yes. Well, I think we've learned a lot more that, how important our waters are.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And do you have anything else you'd like to add, or any comments or anything?
No, let me look here.
Oh, sure.